QA stories. A lot of us have known for some time that Agile goes beyond just software development, and actually a lot happens beyond just the delivery team. He's Chief Evangelist for Eliason Group. He's been helping enterprises really adopt Agile methods in their entire operations. And he was previously, he created and led, what is it, the Agile Center of Excellence? Oh, yeah, Global Logic, your former company. Yes. So that's a little bit of background.
So wanted to start off, well, there's a lot more people here than I've ever seen before at one of these meetings. So I know it's not me, so it's got to be the content. If I can get a raise of hands, just a show of hands, how many are here for like either the first or second time? And I'd like to ask why. Is it the content? Agile QA? Did you show up for the other one with Janet Gregory? I see a lot of nodding of heads and everything. Okay. As a 30-year QA guy, you should show up more often, especially if you're interested in Agile and QA. Anyways, well, get on with it. Ron, did you get all that information? Yeah. And I'm going to make the video taper really work tonight, because I can't stand still. Name is Johnny Scarborough. I'm the Chief Agilist at this Eliason Group. I lead the delivery side of the Agile practice. I've actually got, as my wife just pointed out to me, I need to change it to 30 plus years now. It's no longer 25, but I say that it fits. In product development, I started off in QA in the early 80s. So I've been doing QA a long time, doing lots of other roles as well. The last 5 years I've been coaching, consulting in Agile practices, technology, management, lots of different things. I am Innovation Games training facilitator, and shout out to Brian. Agile Games is a great event. Go to it. It's worth it. It's cheap money. Lots of interesting ways. There's lots of interesting ways to get information, and it will help for all of you that are just QA folks or interested in QA side, it will help you out there too. And I'm a proud parent of 3 teenagers, so I know a lot about adapting. So let's start off. We're going to be talking about Agile and quality. I'm going to bring in a lot of what I've seen, and I look back, I had like actually about 140 slides. So I know that's too much to fit into an hour, so I actually redacted it down quite heavily, and I've spent all week, and Ron's been here and we talked about it all week. Because Agile and quality, there's so many other aspects that we have to worry about. And for those that know me, and there's a few people here, I'm a big fan of motorcycles. So you can have a lot of motorcycle and car, hot rod references throughout this whole talk. So to me, that is the definition of quality. Nice custom motorcycle, doing exactly what I want. But we really need to actually look to define quality. And so looking around for some various different definitions, what is quality? So we looked up there, ISO 9000, degree to which a set of inherent characteristics fulfills requirements. That sounds nice, waterfall-ish way. It's the spec. Go to the spec. But what I really like, Robert Persigs, anyone know who he's the author of? Exactly. I actually read that in the late 70s. Kind of set the whole stage. The result of care. I really like that because that fits into that Agile mindset. Gerald Weinberg. Value to some person. Also fits into that Agile, the definition of quality. And Taguchi, the loss a product imposes on society after it is shipped. I really like that one. So understanding, those are kind of, we got some very positive ones, and that might be the negative one. But I asked a lot of folks that I work with in the last few months, family, friends, associates, actually a couple of people in this room. I wanted to get some quality attributes. And I asked them to give me one word that describes quality to them. And so I got like this list of words. Valuable, efficient, beautiful, exceeded, and they said expectations. I asked for one word. Performance, available, all these sort of things. And we look at these, and we go back to here as well, the result of care, value to some person. Quality is actually quite subjective. We want it to be nice and black and white, nice subjective, where we can say, yep, it's quality or it's not. But it really is this sliding scale. because it all is kind of in the eye of the beholder. So if we start to look at these, all of these are very good quality attributes. So since I've got a lot of folks here, what are some of, I want to hear from you, because I want to add to this list and maybe update it. What are some of the attributes you think define quality that maybe not up there? I'll give you 30 seconds. Just yell it out.
Metrics.
Metrics.
Integrity. Easy to use. Seamless.
Useful,
Elegant.
consistent.
Sustainable. Intuitive. Works.
As long as I can read it, that's all that matters.
Satisfied. Lack of flaws.
Lack of,
Lack of flaws. So flawless. Flawless.
Expensive.
yeah. So, I mean, if we look at this, I mean, we heard a lot of different possibilities here from everyone here. Or not everyone. So we have to look at this from the perspective of, it is subjective. So we need to understand then, especially in our Agile context, what is the quality values, our market, our customers, our clients, what are we actually trying to, we're building something, in this case mostly software, maybe hardware, we're building something to fill their needs. So when I look at it, I start to think about what quality really means to me. And, you know, I take it down to, a lot of those one word. I come up with the phrases, does what I need it to do when I need it to do it. For me, that's what quality is. It's nothing more, nothing less, but it does what I need it to do when I need it to do it. So, as we look at this, one of the other aspects is there's a lot of talk, and I think maybe why we've drawn so many other folks out with the title Agile QA, is that when we look at things like the Agile Manifesto, a lot of people see this as being written for developers, by developers. QA is the stepchild over there on the side, maybe with red hair. And so we start to take a look at this, and I look at, we got individual interactions over process and people, or processes and tools, responding to change order plan. Those two plans and processes, a lot of that relates to us in QA. Because we're known as the process people. We like to be oriented around a plan. We like, especially those of us who come from the waterfall, and I'm a recovering waterfallaholic. We always liked our test strategies, our test plans, everything written out to the nth degree. We wanted our requirements all full, complete, so that we could write all of our test plans before we actually got the product or even saw anything. So we start to take a look at those 12 Agile principles, off of everything. And I start to take a look at valuable. That's one of the elements that I've gotten from a quality attribute. We see developers listed a couple times: continuous, excellence, simplicity, the team. And just recently, it actually was, I think a few months ago when Ken Schwaber was here last, he actually talked about the new Scrum Guide, which he actually had some clarification from the Scrum side of things, which I actually really like to see. And I want to make sure that this is the point that we all get across, is that he's looking at changes part of the Scrum Guide. So the team of people performing the work of creating an increment is the development team. Regardless of the work performed by individual team members, they are all known as developers. And I've been saying this for years, that QA is just part of the product development team. So if I say the word developers, I actually mean the whole team. QA has to be part of that. We have to take a whole team approach within Agile specifically. So we start to take a look at QA. How many people in here are QA engineers or QA testers or any of those? Good. So there's a lot of, I've seen it called QA engineers, quality control engineers, testers, lots of different terms. And I want us to actually think about it in the sense of, there's really two A's in QA, specifically within Agile. We got the one, quality assurance. In a lot of larger companies, I see quality assurance being purely concerned about the process. They don't do any validation, they don't do any verification, they don't do any testing. They're only concerned about walking through the process. So quality assurance, full confidence or trust, freedom from doubt, certainty. An assessment, appraisal or evaluation. Quality assessment, quality assurance. That's what we actually do. In Agile, and as we go forward through this, I propose that anybody doing Agile QA, you gotta do both. You gotta be worried about the process. You gotta be worried about how you're doing testing, what you're testing, why you're testing it. And also we're gonna talk about how. Now please, any questions? I'm gonna wanna get a rise out of you at least once during this. Please feel free to raise your hand. I'll call you out. And so we want to get on to kind of like news from the front. I actually took a look at the last about 6 to 9 months of work that I've done as a coach and consultant. Actually, I did see a client or two of mine here, so none of your stuff's in there, guys. Don't worry. And I got on this really big kick with World War II movies since Christmas. I got a whole bunch of them, like about 100 of them. So the old newsreel type of approach. So one of the patterns or trends that I see, of course, and I'm sure everyone is well aware of, is outsourcing or distributing the QA team. You know, whether it be China, West Coast, even in Boston, one side of the, I had to put the Patriots up there. It's a big weekend. Canada, Ukraine, Kiev, St. Petersburg. And in my previous company, I actually was in charge of doing a lot of that stuff. I was on the offshore side. How many people here have offshore QA departments? Quite a bit. Well, offshoring QA and just the QA team, while in and of itself, it's not a horrendous thing. But how we do it, we want to avoid this. We got dev residing here, and QAs somewhere else. And this is the first thing that every company I've ever seen do offshore, or outsource, or distributed. They split them up. Now, does that represent, how many people in here does that represent how their QA teams are? Where they're actually completely separate, they're offshore. I got 2. Now, the rest of you that I had in your hands that were distributed, are there QA and devs both residing together? Yes. Are they in the same exact environment, or are they in the same country, and one's in Chennai and one's in New Delhi or Bangalore? So they're really not next to each other. They are separate. It's actually even distributed worse. So we've got the development side distributed in a couple places. QA team might be distributed even further. I have a slide for that, but I didn't put it up there because it gets too messy. Because I had a slide from one of my clients where they had their QA team. Parts of their QA team were in Chennai, parts were in Noida, parts were in Pune, and Toronto. And their development was also spread out. They were in they had 12 people on the team and 8 different locations. But we really want to avoid this. We want to avoid the separation. There's some warning lights here, definitely. When you have ownership in just one location, where the team is split across those geographies, a lot of times we see less than daily whole team communication, where I mean dev, QA, everybody is on the phone, in person, on Skype, or some type of video conference. If they're on there less than daily, big warning light. And if the primary collaboration is peer-to-peer or through a technical lead who might be sitting onshore. There was a group of people, I think you're still sitting back there, I overheard you saying exactly this, that you had technical leads here, working with your offshore teams, and I don't think you were saying it in a positive way. Was I mistaken? So, other aspects of this, whole team meets in real time, less than 2 weeks, 2 times per week. So there's really almost a lot of email communication going on. A lot of them, I didn't see really have any collaboration tools. I know we have someone from Raleigh here, somewhere, John. So one of the big things is if you are distributed, you're going to need a bigger emphasis on the tools that you have in place. You're going to need lots of tools. not just collaboration tools. Another aspect I see is you got a big warning light. No whole team participation in the kickoffs for new projects, sprint reviews, retrospectives. You really need to get people all overlapped at the same time. Teams will get out of sync, especially dev and QA. Where dev is going here, you've got a 24 to 48 hour. If you're working with folks in India, and I've made over 90 trips to India since '92. I love working over there. But if you have a problem, you send something over, you expect to get test results, it's going to be 24 to 48 hours plus before you really get the feedback on it, generally, especially if there's problems. No real-time status. One of the key aspects, whether you're using Scrum, XP, Kanban, any of that, we really want to have almost that real-time status capability. We want to have that immediate contextual feedback from the team at hand. The other thing is finger pointing. It's going to happen. Especially, I think the new term instead of offshoring teams is managed service providers. Reduction in force sounds less, managed service providers. Usually a third party. Not your own company, someone else. And yes, I do work for a staffing company. So, but if it's a managed service provider, so if you're, I'll just use Constant Contacts since we're in their building, and they're using Wipro or HCL or Tata or EPAM, which is going public this week. They're mostly based in Eastern Europe. You're at their beck and call. And a lot of times, especially with some of the larger companies, and I know I see some people from PMC here, and in these larger companies, they're held almost captive by their vendors. How agile is your vendor? Nothing against Wipro, Tata, HCL, and these others. But a lot of times I see our QA teams being held captive. They're doing QA their way. You might be agile here, but they're going to do QA their way if you've offshore, outsourced to a managed service provider. Large insurance companies I know that use them, they're held captive. They're held at bay. They can only do as much as their managed service providers. There are some possible successes, even in this model. It's one big hand list, by the way. You've got to do all of this to actually see some success. You can perform that complete function entirely in another locale. And you need good Scrum or good Agile implementation in place. And you need GO1 and GO2 to have overlap. You have to have a lot of overlap. If you're using Costa Rica, Argentina, it's great, because there's complete overlap, 8 hours. You want regular face-to-face contact. You're going to need that. That's why I made 92 trips to India, because we needed that regular contact. You also need good tools for the collaborative work structure, for communication, testing, reporting, all those other elements. You're going to need these tools. And you need strong functional ownership. You need a partner. You have to be truly partnered, joined at the hip with those folks. And if you're not with your managed service provider, you're not going to get the full output that you possibly can. They're your vendor. You're the client. You can control them. But the better way is to do it is really to create and move some of your development also over there. I'm not trying to say do more offshore, but put a whole team together with some strong leadership, with possible proxy product owner, someone who's there. That's the better way. If you're going to do it, put both dev and QA together so they're working side by side and they can output a whole piece. Just putting QA over there, and back in the early 90s, that was the first thing that I saw, under cost arbitrage, eject out QA, put it out somewhere else. And it could be, we could be looking at Canada, we could be looking at Costa Rica, Argentina, Brazil, lots of different choices. Everyone seems to want to push that out. QA is the first one to go. If we look around, and another show of hands. I'm going to try and use your other hand so you can get an even exercise here. How many folks had what was their first offshoring? Was it the QA team or was it some other team? So QAs, folks, first team offshore, fair enough. Development, was it offshore? Well, I'm sure it was an even split. I'm quite surprised. Usually it's always QA first. Another pattern trend that we come across.
Then why is that? Why is QA first?
Thank you. So QA usually is first because it's thought of as, and especially in the earlier 90s, it was thought of as it's easier to do. Everybody can do QA. Anybody in there can do QA. Or I can just put it off to lower quality folks.
It's a liability. They don't see it as value, the actual value, realizing the value of the product. They see it as a necessary evil. Well, I guess we can't ship it unless we test it.
Yeah, and that's that waterfall view. And we still see it, even with Agile teams, I've seen them offshore their QA, because they're actually devaluing it. Because they do consider it necessary evil sometimes. Other places, I'm painting a very select group of, I'm looking for all this is the popular trends. And working with about, in the last 6 to 9 months, about 20 different companies, this is the most common trend about offshoring. So some of them are even getting into it for the very first time, even though they're small companies. I see it from small companies to large companies. But it is, a lot of the time, and I made the decision as a QA director years ago to offshore my QA group. Because I fell victim to that too. So I'm always a recovering waterfall pod. Luckily, I don't think there's any of my old team members here. But we did it for cost arbitrage, because it was got to keep the budget down. But it was also, in some cases, a lot of people say, I want to globalize it. I want around the clock. I want to be able to test around the clock. Well, if you outsource your whole QA group, you're not around the clock anymore. So, another pattern and trend, and actually, we're going to go through 3 of these. I've got about 40. I got it down to about 3. They're all relatively equal. The QA bottleneck. This is one I was actually just on the phone earlier today working with a client because everything is bottlenecking into QA. It's all stacking up into QA. Anybody hear of this problem where QA is the bottleneck?
No, we overhired too many engineers.
So, that's a good point. So, Tom just said we have too many engineers.
Yeah.
So, we have a capacity or impedance problem.
There's some of the answer.
What are some of the other reasons? We got a lot of QA folks here, we're bottlenecked. You might actually be the bottleneck, or your team is the bottleneck. It could be a person who's the bottleneck, if you've only got a team of 1. Right.
I think there's a certain dynamic where you can, I guess I would say, defer quality, and QA is the last people. So you can do mediocre requirements to maybe get away with it. You could do mediocre development and maybe get away with it in the short term. But ultimately, QA is kind of the last step before it goes out the door. That seems to be where things hit.
And there was a great post by someone today on the Big Visible team with regard to, big legacy systems. All right, do we do unit test or not? I think was the title of it. You got to read your stuff. And the whole thing was that they were bottlenecking into QA as well, as backing up into QA. They were looking at unit tests as being the full solution and the panacea to solve all their problems, but it really isn't. What it was is that there is a lack of requirements. David?
Too much work in process at the same time.
Yes, for those doing WIP limits and stuff like that.
Well, you end up with a number of things coming together at one point in time, and little bits of each thing happening in development along the way.
Oh, sorry, I forgot the golden rule. I'm going to be after that.
It's the big handoff. The bigger the handoff, the bigger the bottleneck.
To say it again, too much work in process at the same time. Developers are doing a little bit of a number of things, and they end up finishing a lot of those items at the same time. The demand on testing and other quality assurance activities become much greater than they can handle. and upstream from that, they may not be as effective at the time.
And there was a David in front of you. I forgot that there's two Davids right there.
It's an occupational hazard. Yeah, I guess it's a question that has a comment wrapped in it in terms of a bottleneck. How does one do testing and quality control of software before its development? Sounds like that would be the only way to avoid the bottleneck.
There's one way, that's leading into test-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, ADD, DBD. Well, it's also, I mean, that's one of the possible ways to look at the solving. We've also got, part of this is, and David and I were talking about this, we're talking about this a little bit earlier. A lot of QA-dev ratios. I know I used to live and breathe by them 15 so years. I have to have no more than one QA person per 5 developers. I've actually thrown up some, I've got some folks that are doing 1-to-1. I've actually got, and I actually did 2-to-1 ones, where I had 2 QA people per developer. It was more on the hardware side of things. It was just certain process elements that needed to be happening right there. I also have a client who's doing right now 1 to 15. 1 QA person per 15. They're having a QA problem. And they're not here. They're not in the New England area and stuff. So we try to take a look at it. That's just one of the things. It's like we don't have enough QA people. We have too many engineers, the opposite. That's not necessarily always a full solution as well. We could add more QA folks. And this is something that you're going to see over time that, there's going to be a difference. And David, David Jellison, how did you put it earlier? Because, there was you had a great comment, we were talking about this earlier, about kind of that equalization over time, kind of figure out the baseline.
So we typically go with 3 to 1, three developers to 1 quality engineer as an expectation in our teams, but over time we find that for certain types of work, there are natural ratios will balance out. When you have enough teams in a larger organization, it's easier to do this, but you've got to recalibrate those ratios, and you've got to be constantly looking at whether those ratios are working well or not. And so on the flip side of that, once you find that nice trend, it becomes a constraint to help drive process improvement and other activities that drive the efficiencies based on the expectation that is the optimization.
I'm glad you used the word expectation because actually the last talk here, which was actually almost a year ago, I think it was April of last year, so 10 months ago, Janet Gregory was here. She's co-author of an Agile testing book. Actually, I think it is really the only true Agile testing book that's out there, with Lisa Crispin. She has the expectations of an Agile tester. These are what we expect most of our Agile testers to deal with. Test without the formal requirements document. Actually, someone's got it? David, thank you.
We'll be giving them out at the end of the...
We're giving away some?
2 copies.
Oh, good. It's a very good book. Test in real time, test on changing code, test on changing requirements, automate all the tests, and be part of a close-knit team. That's a lot. That is a lot to expect of people. So, start to talk about some of the warning lights when we're talking about where there's a QA bottleneck. Obviously, we all kind of know. Testing is stacking or backing up at the end of the iteration, the sprint, or if you're using queues, if you're doing Kanban. A lot of the testing is limited to the stories at hand, like barely getting through the stories that you have due in that particular sprint, iteration, or process. System regression testing is inconsistently run, or not at all. We're seeing a lot of defects escape. The escape rate is meaning they're being found much later on. We're finding defects in future sprints, iterations, or after release. QA folks are always working late, weekends, around the clock, builds not available. Those are all kind of warning signs that we're going to have a bottleneck, or that we're actually already in one. And there's lots of ways to mitigate this. Some of those things are, the ratios that you might have had beforehand if you're moving, especially for newer teams that are moving from waterfall to an agile method, whether it be Scrum, or XP, Kanban, Crystal Meth, whatever. I just like to say that, Crystal Method. Sometimes you want your QA people on Crystal Method. They work hard and fast. Short, hard, burst of time. Sorry, I'm not promoting drug use. Caffeine is a good one. So, ratios that worked before may no longer be applicable, but just like in Agile, we want to inspect and adapt. I know, David, you kind of leveled off at like 3 to 1, 3 developers per QA person. Some teams might be 2 to 1. Some might be 1 to 1 at times. You're going to have to inspect and adapt because not everything is going to be the same. The skill sets, we're going to get into a little bit about this. The skill sets that worked before in your waterfall ways aren't going to scale over to what you need to do in Agile. Agile takes a bigger set of skills. As we go back, I go back to the expectations. Automate, test on changing code, test on changing requirements, test in real time. You're going to need someone who's both doing assessing, meaning being able to test, and that's going to mean writing automation. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. Oops, not that. Skill sets that worked before. So you're going to have to look at different skill sets, most likely. As a manager, a director, and a VP of groups, of QA groups, this was a hard thing. When I started to move into more Agile stuff, I needed to up the skill sets. Some people that were great manual testers, I didn't get rid of, because you still need to do some manual testing. One way out is automate, but not every QA person can automate. And it's not that you have to automate everything. You may hear me talk a lot about automation, and those that know me know that I talk about tools, I talk about automation, and everything like that all the time. Because it's a way for us to free up the time. We want to use these wonderful computers. They're automatons. They're supposed to be robots to do our bidding. Sometimes they rule us, sometimes we rule them. But we want to use them to what they're really good at, doing repetitive tasks, mundane tasks. First thing you can do is have a human just sitting there, looking at the same thing, is it being spelled the right way, clicking through things, looking for those things, just looking for the systemic or functional things. You're gonna have to do manual testing. I'm not gonna say get rid of it all. Because manual testing, when you get into subjective, like user interaction, is it pretty or not? Computer can't really tell that. That's what you're gonna have to set some eyes on. And you're gonna have constraints, budget, policies, skill sets. We're going to have to live with those. So we're going to have to make sure that we're all going to be open, transparent, and visible. If we don't have enough QA people, we're going to have to say we don't have enough QA people. We can't get more on the budget, then we have to limit the input. We want to do impedance matching. Any EEs out here or audio engineers? All right, impedance matching. Ground loops, all these nice little things. I want to make sure I have the right impedance match, or I'm going to have some problem. Definition of done. You want to make sure that you've got a definition of done. Everyone has one of those, right? Everyone follows it, right? As a coach, I know you don't. I get called in with that a lot, because people don't do it. Get a definition of done. And actually, a little bit further. Your definition of done, expand it into a definition of quality. What is the quality expectations? Taken from your market, your customers, your clients. Build it in. Measure yourself if you're doing Scrum, every sprint, every iteration. Make sure that you're defined, you're meeting all of those elements. Someone earlier said metrics. You can create a metric. They have a definition of quality of metrics. Add it in. Measure yourself against these things. Any questions? I see some nods.
So, to the extent,
We have a lot of Davids here tonight.
yeah, to the extent that quality is subjective, it seems impossible then to have any automated definition of a subjective property.
Well, definition of quality. When your definition of done, you're really looking at that from the perspective of the market or customers you're serving. You want to make sure that you're going to be the doneness of your stories, your doneness of those elements. definition of quality, you want to write that in the voice of your client, your customer, your marketplace. You have to involve them. There's going to be subjectiveness, and it's going to grow. Your definition of done doesn't stay static, does it?
Maybe, but that's not my point. Right? My point is that you can't, if it's subjective, then you can't automate testing.
Well, there's going to be, I'm not saying that we have to just completely automate this element. We're talking about how we can actually go across what is the definition of quality? What are we going to have to do? What are all the elements we need to control here? In the sense of this team's, every team has their definition done, every team added to it these definition of qualities, and that's going to be for maybe that project that's, it's going to grow over time. What are all the basic elements? Do we want to be the integrity, the usefulness, all these things? We want to have those and put into more objective things so we can say, yeah, we've accomplished that. Because you're going to be doing that within the realm of your market, your customer.
Another day.
Another day. You guys only hired David?
Yes, it's a policy.
Yes. Well, we do have to scatter ourselves throughout the room. Just to make sure.
You're actually all right behind each other.
No, I just wanted to add that one trap that my company fell into at one point is when we were figuring out how much work to do in a sprint, we weren't counting how much work it would take to QA that work. So, there's the ratio of QA people to developers, but there's also, you can end up with some tasks that take a lot more to QA than other tasks.
Now, did that come out when you're doing your, I'm assuming you're doing Scrum?
Yes, we are.
All right, so in your sprint planning session, when you're doing your estimations, did that come out? When you did do you play planning poker?
Well, the time when things went, when the sprint went bad, when we discovered that this problem was, because we only had one sprint where this was a problem, and then after that, we accounted for that. We talked about it in the retrospectives and decided to add that to the spreadsheet when we figured out.
Good, you learned.
Continuous improvement.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, one of the key things for those that are in QA, I assume that you're all going to the sprint planning meeting, and you've got a voice at the table. There's a lot of folks that don't have their QA folks, especially if they're offshore. David, jealous of them.
Comment on John. So, when we're talking about objective and subjective notions of doneness, as you continue to iterate through the evolution of the product line, you have this accumulating density of your application, and automated tests allow you to assure that working software, working systems stay working, and you can't just scale up the testing exponentially as you continue to add features. So you have to be able to manage that technical debt and be able to very quickly make sure that things that are already done don't break and stay working. So you can focus on splitting your time between investing in new regression testing and manual testing in the cadence that you're used to in the teams.
You guys are helping me slide right in, because my next pattern and trend that I want to talk about is automated testing, or lack thereof.
No, I need to be David to ask a
I
question.
need someone other than a David to ask me.
Let's hear in terms of how to accommodate testing within an Agile sprint. I heard two comments, which could be alternative or whatever, whether you can comment on how those work. One is, within a sprint, to regard each sprint as, say, a 2-week waterfall within the sprint, unchanging requirements. The other is, in sprint N, you test for the last sprint, N-1, so that in a sprint you develop for one backlog and test what was done in the previous backlog. Can you comment on either of the, or both of those two?
I could talk all day about either one of those. Let's hold those until the end, because those are actually pretty big ones as well. And they might be answered here. So the third pattern and trend I'm going to talk to you about tonight, automated testing, or lack thereof. Recently just worked with a client who is doing purely manual testing, trying to do that all within a sprint. And we actually went through a bunch of sprints to much pain. And this is what we had. When we actually put it up there, we kind of sold them on the aspect of automated testing. They were trying to do it. So we had 10 sprints worth of stuff. New features kind of went up and down along the way. You can see that first line there, new features. I'm sorry, my slides shows up better on my screen. So. New features, we added 10 in the first sprint, 20 in the second, 5 in the third. So if we start to take a look at just the new feature regressions as we grew through this. So then, third iteration, we've got 35 regressions because each sprint previous is the next sprint's regression. So we're adding to it. Well, they're actually adding to an existing product set, which had existing already 226 test cases that needed to be executed. So by the end of the 10th sprint there, they had to be running 971 test cases. Problem was, is we figured out the average time to run each test was 2 hours annually. It's a little bit more than the number of hours in a 2-week sprint. So when we went through this, we actually looked at all this. This sold them on, oh yeah, we probably need to look at some automation. I'm trying to tell them that. Wasn't in the budget.
You're double counting, Mike. In that second row, you're just adding the one in the one column to the previous one, but you're doubling it every time. So you're adding the same thing over and over again.
Right, so there was 10 in the very first one. We actually had, it was actually, I'm off actually by a little bit, it should have been 246, well, 236 tests. Because, my math is off, yes. Because we added 10 new features, that becomes actually the 10 tests. So it was 236 was actually, because we added 226 new.
That's not the column I'm concerned about.
Which column?
All right, go to the next
I like
one. So
that.
you've got
This
those
next one?
20, those 20.
Mhm.
Where did you get
That 10.
that 10, right?
That
So
is
go
now
to
in that
the next
regression.
one, Right,
Yep.
right.
So I've got, this is all, so I've got to run, in effect,
Oh, these
all
are
of
running the tests, these are not.
execution. Yes. These are the actual running tests. At worst case, I'll be off by 10 at the whole thing.
No, you're still extra, you got double counting those.
So I've got these back. This is that plus this. So the one previous.
So then why don't you double count the bottom row?
Well, I'm
You
just
still have to
adding
run
on,
the
these are the
226.
existing ones. So these are existing features. We're not testing, that's your system test, your actual overall system
We can
test.
talk about this afterwards. It's your double
Actually,
count.
we'll see.
Your slide just got created.
I like that. But it really was, they agreed to it. This is from their data sets, so I'll need to take a look at it. But in the end, there was no way that they could actually go through and physically test this. We're actually able to get a lot of those existing system features automated and run in an actual automated test in a little less than 5 minutes. Now they could run those every single time. There really wasn't a whole lot of UI involved in this. There was lots of running of things. We could run it across the various different systems. But one of the key things that we came away with is manual testing. And I don't think anyone here can actually agree that it is going to scale out if you have that type of situation. And that's actually a smaller situation. I was one of the last companies that I worked for in the product development space. I was one of the founding engineers in Agile, small data warehouse company that's now owned by IBM. We had to test all the possible functions of a database. Internals, externals, ODBC, JDBC, all the different types of connectors, and on a matrix of hardware that actually covered everything from a terabyte to a couple of petabytes worth of size. We ran 26 million tests a day. We couldn't do it. We had a grid system. We had hundreds of racks of equipment to run it against. We could never have done it in a manual way. It just doesn't scale out. Plus, we could use the machines as the automatons they are. We did try in the very beginning to do a lot of that stuff, cover a lot of the aspects of these major systems. We missed big things. We missed major feature sets. Completely missed them. And with a database, if you ever got a wrong answer, you're dead. You're also never going to have enough time. You're never going to have enough time to do it. You can scale it out. You can try to buy your way out of the problem by adding hundreds of people to it. That generally doesn't scale with a budget, probably. But the other thing is that you have to look at is, you're still going to have to do manual testing. There are some things that are just not worth it to automate. There are certain things, the look and feel. You're going to need the human mind, and you're going to have to be putting on your customer hats to do that. But I will say, and to be or do Agile, you will need to do automated testing. In fact, I don't think you can actually do Agile QA without automated testing. Another David, I know.
I don't know if you can get to this later, but you comment on the ease and value of GUI testing versus testing below the GUI.
Oh, testing below the GUI is much easier. Much easier. And in fact, a lot of the times doing actual automated GUI testing is very expensive. It's tough. You know? So working with the developers. So this is how you can get to some deeper levels of, you know, always look to do unit testing. That's done generally by, I put it up there, it's done by developers, should be done by developers. Component or integration testing, always. These are things that CI, Damon, CI, continuous integration. I think Damon knows a little bit about this. Damon, yeah, finally something other than Damon. Damon Pool, so Acura, great tool. I actually bought it when I was at the team. Functional testing, yeah, you want to automate that if it's possible to automate it. I'm not saying that you have to. I would as much as possible. If you can make that so that work with your development teams to open up service layers, APIs, work at that level so that you're not doing it at the GUI level because you can drive it faster. You know, depending on your architecture, this is where your architecture is. Designing for testability, big thing. You want to make sure that you got to work. This is where QA and dev, you got to have them working close together. So if they're 12 plus hours apart, that makes it really tough. System, acceptance, regression, release, all of those, you want to automate those as much as possible. And again, that is something that you're going to have to work out. And specifically, now I know David Jellison, you might be looking, because you're looking at a wider, across many different QA teams and Scrum teams and everything. You might be looking at instituting a kind of a standard process or standard policy procedures across the organization. You want to automate as much as possible. Because that's one way to get it out, so that you can get better contextual feedback to the developers. The second they've actually checked in their code, it should be starting up some build. Start up the unit test. This is where the automated tools come in. Start up your unit test. If it passes the unit test, go on to the functional, the system, run down the list. Each one just running through. We can automate those. There's lots of great tools out there. You've got other aspects of acceptance test-driven development, where you're getting into the actual acceptance test cases, writing those up beforehand, making sure, lots of different TDD. I love TDD. Really tough for getting the developers to start to, hardcore, hardline, old school developers to actually start to do it this way. But definitely, some of the warning lights when you're looking at the automation side of things, no CI in place. Go ahead.
Performance.
Oh, I didn't put it up there. It should be on there. I mean, that could fall into that system, regression, release as well. Load testing, same type of thing. Performance testing generally can be done because you're going to be running that in generally, if you're doing a full system performance, are you doing performance on the unit level, component level? Performance testing almost hits every single level. And if you actually wrap those different elements, you can start to look at for the performance degradations across any one of those levels. Time everything, or looking, profiling of your code as well. So if you've got no CI in place, big warning light. You can't do continuous integration. Fire up builds, you can't get consistent builds. That's a big red warning light. no or minimal repeatable unit testing in place, that's a form of automation. That's not the panacea. And as I would recommend going over to Big Visible's blog, there was just one put up there today by someone, do you know who it was? Tony Torrey?
I thought it was, but it was David Land. This is another one out there.
I just saw it today. It was some notice I got in an email. Via Constant Contact, I believe, too. Regression testing, not run every sprint iteration. Should be able to do, this is one of the things, when you get into automation, being able to run almost the full systems of regression testing every sprint. Should be run every other sprint, getting as much as possible. If you're starting with a big legacy system, it may not be possible right away because you don't have everything automated from before. But again, don't incur more technical debt by just pushing it off and using that as an excuse. Lack of testing is a technical debt, and you've got to carry it, and it'll grow quickly. And it grows with an unknown interest rate. I'll tell you, it's a really high interest rate, because you're going to have a balloon payment sooner or later. You talk about sprints at the end where I do all my testing or system testing, I do a testing sprint. I kind of hate having to do that type of thing, but sometimes you got no other choice. But don't do it more than once.
Comment on the testing sprint idea. We found that as we scaled up our teams and needed to automate more, that continuous delivery was automating all of our deployments up front early on in our cycles and continuing to test that daily enabled us to be able to run systematic tests daily across our entire regression suites. And that made a huge difference in our ability to keep up the pace and be able to respond to marketplace quickly.
Yeah, so if you start automating it and throwing it in there and just run it against, have continuous testing, just like you have continuous integration, you can have continuous testing, functional, system, regression. You start to build up on it, and then you can exploit it. So the other thing is test bleeding into next sprint iteration or holding you back at a queue if you're doing Kanban work. Always a different, that's a warning light. Need to keep adding test or sprints or test iterations. Not a good thing. Defects piling up and getting at the end of the sprint. Or maybe all of the testing doesn't happen until the end of the sprint. Meaning waterfall. Really, 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 really dangerous and really painful. Trying to cram in all of the testing into the last 2 days of the sprint, you're going to have failures. You're going to see the escape routes. You're going to miss hitting your commitments or your forecasts, depending on your place of work. You're also going to find that features that used to work, you're going to see regressions creep in. And you don't notice them until the very end, or they bleed in. You don't notice it until the next iteration or next sprint. Maybe your managed service provider only does manual testing. If your managed service provider is saying, we're only going to do manual testing, get a new one. I know that's a really rough question, and if you work for one of those companies, I apologize, but you should be doing, again, who's the vendor, who's the client in those relationships. Find the right ones. There's lots of them out there that will do it. Some of those mitigations, you're going to need tools to help you. There's lots of tools out there. I'm a fan of Selenium and certain things for web. I even like QTP sometimes. I prefer to go through more open source tools. And they're not dated.
So what's wrong with QTP then?
No, I'm just.
No, you said sometimes you would prefer like high cost like Selenium, not in terms of the tool, but in terms of how hard it is to wedge it in to actually create the test, or pay $8,000 for the tool, and then you can pretty much test whatever Java plugin, whatever web interface you can. So what's
I won't
wrong?
get into
What's
tools
wrong
today.
with it? No, it's no. But I just wondering.
No,
who would-
I like to pick the appropriate tool. So, if I've got a 14 millimeter nut, I'm not going to use a 12 millimeter wrench. I'm going to use a 14 millimeter wrench. I'm going to use the right tool, and that's going to be possibly a team metric or anything like that. QTP doesn't fit everything. If you've got all of this internal API layer stuff, on
No,
other things, but
I'm talking UI. I'm talking UI only. I'm not talking
the lower end stuff.
Lower end
PGP
stuff,
might be fine. It might be the right tool, especially if you've got those skill sets in your team. Then it's probably the right tool. If you've got more tools, knowledge in Selenium, use that. Don't go out and buy PGP if everyone knows how to use Selenium, and Cucumber, or Python. Pick the tools that are appropriate. By that I mean appropriate to your needs, but also to the skill sets you have in your team. But the key thing is the right tool. We also want to design in testability. This is where I think one of the Davids earlier was talking about, having an issue, I think Dave Kramer, I think you brought it up. So one of the things is designing in testability. You have the capabilities, if you're doing Scrum or other ones that are based on every iteration, your planning meetings. Bring it up. QA. If you know it's going to be really, really, really hard to test something, make sure you use the appropriate size card when you're doing your planning poker games or your sizing games. This is your chance to vote. This is a chance to make the rest of the team aware of the difficulties you have. Development may have come in at, let's say you're using the Fibonacci scale, they may come in at a 3, you're coming in at a 20. Right? Now you have that discussion. Maybe they can do a little bit of work on the development side. They might have to come up a little bit in their complexity and effort that they have to actually accomplish something. That'll make your job easier. That maybe they're going to add in a hook so you can do some fault insertion testing, or a hook so you can do an actual API test. Some other way. They're going to have to possibly have to code it. That's the time to discuss it every week, or every 2 weeks, or whatever your sprint is. Automate wherever you can, but automate what's useful. Some of these things I like to see as much automated as possible. But there are some things that are just not useful. Some of them it's really, 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 really high cost to automate. And maybe you only need to run it once in a blue moon. But I mean, it's those types of things. You got to make those decisions. It's going to be trade-offs. And it's going to take me 2 weeks to write the automation. All right, one, I need to break it down, so it's a lot less. But you have to start to break it down. Do whatever is possible, what is useful. But also make sure that you have time to automate. So when you're doing your tasking, include automation time. And guess what? If you're really new to automation, it's going to be lots of time. That's the price you're going to have to pay. But again, you're paying down your technical debt otherwise. Do that in every sprint. It'll start to get easier. Maybe you actually go out and you might get a consultant. I know I'm a staffing company, I'm not trying to sell the services. But you might bring in a consultant to actually start building up a library of testing functions that you can make calls to, and also train and coach your internal team so they can come up to skill. But again, if you don't automate in every sprint, you're adding to your technical debt. You also want to do this atomic testing. Try to keep it as small as possible. Much easier, quicker, add it to the system. I like to start unit testing. If your developers aren't doing unit testing, we're going to pay for the quality problems later. Development and QA need to work together to make sure that they understand the value of unit testing. That's where it comes to start. But also, you got to grow your team skill sets. If you don't have automation skills yet, you're going to need to grow them. And it's going to be expensive at first, as far as time and effort. So some takeaways: automate wherever it makes sense. If you're outsourcing, make sure you know the capabilities of the team and the constraints of those teams. You want to exploit your constraints. Look to create a definition of quality. I know David and I will have a big discussion about this later. But it's at least putting it down into words so you start to have a target. Because if you don't have a target, you're never going to know what to shoot for. That's just to help guide decision making. And it's going to change. Quality is going to take the effort of the whole team. QA, if it's separated off, makes it very difficult. It's part of the team. We're all developers. I'm glad that Ken Schwaber's finally changed those words. I made it very crystal clear, at least for Scrum side. Quality is not just those that have it in their titles. That doesn't mean that also that just because we have quality in our titles doesn't mean when we have a quality problem it's QA's fault either. Because one of the other things is that while we can design quality in, We can build quality in. We actually can't test it in. So, thank you. Q&A period. David?
Thought the first questioner would be David. How do you deal with, it seems like just a question of timing within a sprint. If you don't lead the testing to a later sprint, it would seem that at the beginning of a sprint, there's nothing to test, and at the end of the sprint, there's nothing to develop. So assuming that you don't have people who can develop and test interchangeably on the team, how do you take care of the testing people at the very beginning and the development people at the very end?
Write small stories. Use small stories. If you have to wait 2 days before you can actually see anything or test anything, one, you should be actually writing your automated test in that period of time, but you shouldn't have to wait 2 days. Get something from development every single day. Actually try to write down to the smallest story. Sometimes it's not possible. I've got some folks that I work with that, within 4 hours of starting their sprint, they've got something that someone can start to actually execute some tests, small tests. But while you're waiting for that first piece to be delivered, you're not sitting around twiddling thumbs. You're writing automation. So you're busy just while they're developing their code, you're developing the test to test that code. Tom.
So I'm not David. I am not a David. So some of the guidance that we give for that exact situation is at the beginning. QA people can help, as you had in that last slide, help design quality in. Usually the first thing people do is to start coding. Developers will start coding. How about stop and talk about the design? I tested for many years, and I can tell you right now, if I could tell the developer what I'm going to do to break his code, if he knew that before he wrote a single line of code, don't you think what he'll give me later will be different?
Sit down as they're trying to write their code,
Yeah.
all right? And if you're doing test-driven development, you're already writing test cases first before you even do any of that other stuff. But also, this is what I'm going to do from what I know of the acceptance test, and I know this story, this is how I'm going to attack it. It'd be really nice if you added that into your unit testing so that I know that it's already going to be above that barrier before I even get it.
And on the back side of it, when the developer's twiddling their thumbs because they have nothing to develop, my first question is why aren't they sitting with the tester and trying to help test? Because they own the quality of the product too. And if they think it's just the QA guy's job to do that, then they've already missed the whole point of the team. Right? This is team-based work.
That will help your QA ratio. You can reduce it because then you can have one QA engineer for 6 developers that know how to.
Yeah. If you got senior folks, I mean, it can work.
Another suggestion early on is that developing tests is a development activity, and there's many opportunities for optimizing your tests, abstracting out your tests to make them more efficient, and refactoring the code, and making sure that your code base your test code base is as scalable as you can make it. So there's an opportunity there early on to refactor.
Yeah, that's one of the things that kind of, so the point I was making before is that when they're at the end, the developer doesn't think they know how to test. If they sat and watched an average QA person who probably is not a very stellar software developer writing automated test code, they would probably look at it and say, I could probably write that 10 times faster with half the lines of code and we'll be done. And my God, why are you doing it that way? I could do 10 times that way. And then all of a sudden now you've got a developer helping automate. I mean, automation is a hard skill set. For QA people are usually more end user experienced, right? So they're not necessarily going to be great at developing. They may have a great vision of how to write all this automation, but they just don't have the skill set of writing automation.
I'm going to call out Damon, because Tim and I actually talked yesterday. There was something that you said yesterday.
What did you want me to say?
What are you wearing? It's okay. There was something we were talking about yesterday afternoon, you and I, and it was something about what you realized about testing and stuff like that. It really is truly a different mindset. So you can't always have developers learn to do testing.
I remember. It was a sports team, which is dangerous for both of us.
Yes.
Although it would be Johnny Damon, but.
Yes.
We were talking about how actually in many fields it's pretty obvious that you need different skill sets. And one of the things about in sports is you wouldn't put together a baseball team with 9 pitchers, right? Because they can hit, but you need different skill sets. That said, pitchers can still hit, et cetera. So, there you go.
Thank you. One more question. Way in the back of my face. One more. I think we have time for one more question. I'll try to keep my track.
One of the challenges I have in trying to move a waterfall team to Agile is I start with the assumption that test automation is baked into Agile and it's a given. And the director of quality I'm working with says, I believe in automation, all I have to do is cost justify this to my manager. And I was like, fell out of my chair. I didn't know how to answer that question. It's sort of like, it's table stakes, but they don't see it that way. So how do you cost justify automation?
Well, what's the impact on, defects making their way out? We can look at the old adage, I think it's, $1 if I find it in development, $10 to $50 if I find it in QA, $100 to $500 if I find it outside. How much can they get away with, in essence? And how long does it actually take them to do all of their testing? If they could do something, if you can move your testing, and literally you can have orders, in many orders of magnitude, moving to, from a manual perspective, same 10 people doing manual testing, same 10 people writing automated tests and everything like that, that actually execute. So I know Phil and I are going to talk about the math later. Not David. How many? 971 tests we were averaging. There's going to be like 1,800 hours. We don't have that many hours in a week. We can't do all of the testing, so you're going to miss your dates. Things are going to go late. So there's lots of different ways. The classic iron triangle, scope, time, those types of things. And Anton?
I had to do it once, twice in my life. The way I find it easier, I just show the graph. How much does it cost me to do a test run? And so manual is always the same, but it's constantly just flat line. And automation, you're paying up front to develop the test, and then your incremental costs are flat. So at some point, these two lines are going to cross, and then you can prove that after they cross, you actually spending less money.
Yeah, because then it's actually a downward.
Right.
As you're adding to it, it's going to get easier. You're getting, as David said, you got whole systems progression. You can add it on as a cumulative effect. So it's kind of like compounding daily interest type of approach. So I think we got 3 minutes left.
But also sometimes there is, even in automated test, there is an element of maintenance and and I think that's
refactor your tests.
That's sometimes tough to sell, that it takes maintenance. And
You don't sell that.
Don't sell that.
Don't
part.
sell that.
Yeah. But I mean, it is. And I mean, when you're writing code, test code, you got to make sure. But then this is again where you look for the whole team. You've got to have the whole team. You've got to have that holistic, systemic view of it. Because in the long run, yes, I got to update my test. I make drop functionality, so you cut those tests. That's always great when we drop functionality. But I mean, you completely modify it, then you're going to have to modify the tests. There's cost. But that code that you had to modify, you've already got time for that in development. You're going to have the equivalent or possibly more time for QA, but it's going to be known up front, especially in QA. We tend to bury a lot of those things in waterfall. And there was one more in the back.
A QA sprint. My question that is development work take, let's say, a couple of sprint, 4 sprint, and the QA itself will take 2 sprints. So it's the product, the initial development product, how to avoid that to have a QA sprint only.
I'm not a fan of the whole QA sprints only or anything like that. I want to have the whole team. You know, if QA stuff, and there are times when you might have to make the call that, all right, we got to do a QA sprint in the sense of a testing sprint. That means that we've missed something, there's something happening. Development needs to be in there, because I mean, it shouldn't be just one part of the team. It's got to be a team. So the team itself has to figure out if that's what needs. And it's really not a QA sprint. We need one more sprint because we didn't deliver it on time. So I prefer not to call it a QA only sprint or a testing sprint at the end that's added extra. No, it's just one of the sprints that we need to do for delivery and release. Because if you haven't finished all of your testing, then you ain't done. You're not ready to release. So anyways, thank you. Take care.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Johnny. That was a good talk. Just to set the record straight, if your name is David, raise your hand. Let's have a David census here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've counted 6. Okay.